Well, hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys, and I hereby wish you a happy Saturday. Today we're going to be talking about Type 5. It's a much awaited video, I imagine, Enneagram 5, in relation to the INFJ personality primarily, but it's the same with all the videos I'm releasing on that topic, and Type 2 and INFJs, Type 4 and INFJs, 6, and so on. There's always lots that's said about Type 4 and about Type 2 and about Type 6 that's true of it regardless, that are truth claims about these types regardless of whether they manifest in the context of an INFJ or an ISTP or what have you. And it's going to be the same for Type 5. We specifically want to understand what it is about Type 5 that makes it more common among INFJs than typically thought. And in fact, in the top 3 most common, I would argue with Type 6 and with either Type 9 or Type 1, perhaps Type 9, but perhaps Type 1 is in the top 3. That remains to be figured out. But Type 5 is very common. Often you might think that you're a 6 and in fact you're a 5. Sometimes you might think you're a 4 and in fact you're a 5. It's usually between these 3 that there are some confusions, and I want to help you clear those up, okay? In order to follow all the arguments of this video, there's 2 books that I would recommend. There's my new book on the INFJ, which is called The Infinite Soul, and it's available right there. It's all in capital letters. If you haven't got the ebook or the paperback, get a copy now. You have no excuse. It's down there. It's a beautiful book. I will be able to show it to you early next week. Okay. Some technical issues prevent me from doing so yet. I know that there are some among you who they have sent me photos of the book and it looks really good and they're enjoying it. So far, people are loving it, I think. It's fair to say. So get your copy if you haven't yet. It is the sequel, this Infinite Soul, to the Ecstatic Soul, and this book is an investigation of the INFJ mind, the INFJ psyche from an existential point of view. It's a reference book on the INFJ, a best-selling book, and for this video it will be important to, it helps if you read this book, because I'm going to use some concepts from this book, right? So now there's the Ecstatic Soul, there's the Infinite Soul, there's also the Infinite Castle, which is my novel. Came out 2022. Support the channel, get this beautiful book if you like Kafka, Dostoevsky, Camus, Murakami, and main characters 9FJ. At least that's the rumor. So link is below, as well as my Patreon page. Support me, help me keep this channel afloat. If you enjoy my content, the intellectual INFJ, the philosophical INFJ, going deep. By supporting me, you help me keep going. Now, in terms of this Type 5 that we are interested in, and the INFJ 5. So why is it more common than we might think? I mean, the first thing that I think would be fair to say is that it's not as if we're talking about a type that nobody associates with INFJ, and I'm trying to make the point that it's common among INFJs. It's already a type that is really not considered to be that rare for an INFJ to be. A lot of INFJs identify as 5s. So the point in the sense that I'm making as a premise for this video is a little bit more modest, is to say it's even more common than we think, okay? Because there's sometimes the argument that you hear made that compared to the number of INFJs who identify as a 5, more often 5 with a 4 wing rather than 5 with a 6 wing. So given the number of INFJs who do in fact openly consider themselves, view themselves as 5s, there's a little music that comes through our ears across the community and beyond the INFJ sphere that says, there's fewer INFJs that are 5 compared to, than those who think they are. The exact opposite of the argument that I want to make in this video. The argument we usually hear is that a lot of INFJs see themselves as 5s, but there are fewer. Really, some of those INFJs are 4 or 6. And I'm saying, in fact, there's a sizable number of INFJs in the community who see themselves as Type 5s, they're even more numerous than that. So it's the opposite of the music that we tend to hear, particularly from thinking types, who often, when I say thinking types, of course, I'm referring to Jungian cognitive functions and Myers-Briggs. Thinking types have a tendency to believe and to think that type 5 ought to be predominant among thinking types, and INFJ not being a thinking type can't really claim to be commonly correlated with 5. It's not completely stupid to argue that type 5 has a correlation with thinking. There is, to a degree, to an extent, to the extent that it is true, I think, that usually the more unintegrated, infantile, unconscious, repressed your thinking function is, regardless of whether it's TE or TI, perhaps even more so TI, the more this is relegated to the background of your cognition in terms of your preferences or in terms of your proficiencies, the less likely it is that you'll be a 5. That seems to be true. But in the case of INFJs, there's no stopping an INFJ from having well-developed TI. Let's not forget about that. And the correlation between a cognitive function and type 5 is not the sole privilege of TI, all right, or the T function. You see a correlation with NI too. And I think the correlation with NI is really strong. Probably as strong as it is for TI, for the type 5. But now that kind of allows me to move into the next section of this video and argue, try to present you with the argument why type 5 is actually really very common for INFJs. I'm not saying it's the most common type. I think it's in the top 3. I don't know which Enneagram is the most common for INFJs. Probably no one knows. You can hazard a guess. But I think type 5 and type 6 are, in a sense, they're two sides of the same coin. They're two very different sides of the same coin in one sense, but in another sense, they are still side of the same coin. So in order to understand why type 5 is very common for INFJs, it's important that you understand why type 6 is common for INFJs. And that is not always a given, it's not always taken for granted. Because nobody wants to be type 6, because type 6 is described and usually understood by the mainstream as the empty type par excellence. That's a definition, an understanding that I very much combat, that I fight against, that I try to debunk and discredit. For reference, check my previous video where I discussed this. And for more references, check my earlier videos that I released maybe a year ago or a couple years ago on type 6. It's a type that I have reflected a lot on, given that I think it is my core type. Type 1 is also a possibility for me as a core type, but I think type 6 probably ultimately is better. Remains to be completely confirmed, but that tends to be what I associate with the most. Either way, once you more or less get on board with me, in the sense that type 6 is not the empty sort of, the gap Enneatype that we think it is, entirely defined by its wants in terms of lacks. Once we accept that there's real substance to being a 6, we understand better how an INFJ can easily be a 6, and therefore we can understand by contrast why an INFJ can be a 5. Now let me explain. I said earlier in this video that in order to completely understand my arguments here, it's good to have read this book, The Ecstatic Soul. Because in this book, The Ecstatic Soul, and need I remind you, many of you have read this book, but what does chapter 1 say here? Existential alienation. And the most important word is certainly alienation. I've used this word probably thousands of times since this came out in 2021, so I'd be surprised, except for any newcomers here, you all probably know what I'm referring to by alienation in the case of INFJs, and there's been enough empirical confirmation via your responses to me, your own testimonies that this is a real thing. And the basic sense of alienation is when your dominant function is introverted intuition, and your inferior function, your infantile function, your archaic function that you will never be able to completely integrate, is a function of concrete extroverted data gathering, like engagement with the external world, the function of SE, of extroverted sensation. You are the type that is just tailor-made to feel a strong disconnect between your I, between your existence, your sense of sort of being who you are, or being something that exists and has a point of view, or you have a point of view, and the world of external reality. There's just this gap. Everything feels a bit eerie, everything is floating around. You just don't feel completely like you're in there, in the external world. Okay. So often people mistakenly think that it's the case with all N types. That's absolutely not true. For example, if you're a dominant any type, so extroverted intuition, that's external data gathering. It doesn't have the same level of concreteness that SE does, but it's still external data gathering. ENFPs and ENTPs are extremely in the world. Doesn't mean they can be super creative with what they come up with, but they're extremely of this world. Have you not noticed that most ENTPs and ENFPs are pretty happy in the world? Right? Of course, not all of them are, but for them, belonging in the world is not an issue. They have other issues, but that's not an issue. For a dominant introverted intuitive with SE inferior, that is an issue, and the alienation is made double by the fact that, unlike the INTJ, whose TE function can create this kind of objective bridge to reach back to the external world via thinking, and the argument is laid out in the ecstatic soul, the INFJ only has the social function FE, which is essentially dependent on other people, but other people have their own way to function, so that creates a double distance. The objectivity of external reality is just really not something that is very natural for INFJs to experience. So alienation, very basic fact. Note, once you have alienation, this is a point I made about the video on type 4. Once you accept alienation, it becomes very difficult to defend dominant type 4 for an INFJ, because a type 4 is not alienated from external reality. They're alienated from the means to express their identity in external reality. Right? So that's not the same thing. It's almost like the reality of the type 4's existence. It is in fact so non-alienated, so embodied, so full of vividness and richness, and that it's like so high resolution that the means to convey it through, creatively, through speech, to art, is very difficult to actually, it's very hard for it to do justice to the vividness with which that identity is felt. That's the difficulty of type 4, but it almost necessarily presupposes complete non-alienation. So for an INFJ, you're much more likely to be type 6, where, like I said in my previous video, alienation is really a problem for you. You're trying to actually reach into the external reality to assert your identity. So you're searching for your sense of self, you're searching for your sense of belonging, you're searching for your sense of who you are by trying to bridge this kind of seemingly impossible to bridge gap between your internal reality and the reality of the external world. That's type 6. Type 5 is, and this is why I call it the kind of flip side of the coin, and on the other side of the coin is type 6, is type 5 also begins from the point of view of alienation, which is why it's bound to be very common among INFJs, because it's very easy, when you think about it, to correlate type 5 with alienation. But it's because the type 5 is fundamentally a type that is internally, type 5 is an interior type. Type 5 is a type that really lives internally primarily, whose world of values and priorities is very much self-directed. Hence, sometimes what we call the sin of the type 5, avarice or withholding. It's hard for a type 5 to really give generously of their energy to other people. They're always constantly engaged in a process of conserving it. They're concerned, and they really love their own internal mind presence. The type 5 really is like that. It comes with certain challenges, also comes with certain strengths. maybe encourages a certain form of originality and uniqueness and creativity because there's less dependence on the external world. That's the opposite of 6. It's the obverse of 6, the flip side of 6, more precisely. The premise is alienation in both cases, but whereas alienation is perceived as a problem for the type 6, where the goal is to try at all costs to find a bridge to the external reality in order to find a sense of self, in order to find a solid sense of self, not something that's constantly floating around and never finding anchor. The type 5 accepts the alienation and says, that's my identity. My identity is my own world. My identity is the contemplation of the archetypes. Essentially, if you're an INFJ 5, your particular brand of 5-ishness, and that's why I said there's a link between NI and 5-ishness, is that you're going to be alienated through an inner fascination with the archetypes of your psyche. You're going to be contemplating to no end. You're going to love to spend time inside your psyche. And what's inside your psyche, particularly if you're a dominant NI user, is that there's these complexes and archetypes that you can spend time with. Try to familiarize yourself with them. Just consider the works of Carl Jung. Consider speaking of archetypes, consider this amazing thing called the Red Book. If you ever read the Red Book, you'll see things like these, things like these. Oops, apologies. That's like a type 5 doing a lot of introspection. Creates this beautiful present from my wife, by the way. So yes, type 5 says alienation. Yes, I'm noticing it, just like the type 6. But the type 6 has this sensitivity, feels this alienation is painful, they want to reach across to the world. Type 5 says, nay, I'm happy where I stand, thank you very much. And which is why there is a strong correlation between the type 5 and what I call in the INFJ 5 and what I call in the Infinite Soul, new book, the solipsistic INFJ. If we wanted to talk about a sin of the INFJ 5 as opposed to a sin of just that 5, it's solipsism, certainly. Solipsism, almost like the pathological equivalent would be the schizoid personality disorder. Type 6, it's clearly new. It's clearly not solipsism. It's certainly a form of neurosis-related, deeply felt anxiety. But it's two sides of the same coin. For one, it is alienation seen as a challenge, as an obstacle to be dealt with. In the other case, it's alienation seen as a reality that can in itself be accepted as the dwelling for one's sense of self. And on these words, I will stop here because it's been going for a while. I'll see you guys tomorrow. But in the meantime, type 5s and non-5s alike, let me know in the comments what you thought. And yeah, take care, enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Bye-bye.